Probably the greatest gift that you've given me as a YouTube community is forcing me to read more. Read on a consistent basis, whether it be paperback, ebook, audiobook. I'm always consuming that kind of content. And that's the value that I want to now give back to you in this series. Welcome to the first episode of Bibliophile, working title. Bibliophile, the series designed to inspire you to read more nonfiction and to be a better version of yourself by doing so. Here's the pitch. Every episode I'm going to go through a book that I have enjoyed over the years. This one this week is George Orwell's Homage to Catalonia, and my goal is to get you to read this book. I'm not going to be posting affiliate links so that you can buy the book. You know where to get books. Unless the video is sponsored, there's not going to be any sort of affiliate links whatsoever. If you want to support this channel, I ask that you do so through Patreon. Now, for those of you who are already patrons, these specific videos about books, because they're less produced, won't be charged. For the rest of you, if you become a patron, you'll be supporting the larger explorations on my channel, which are well produced with, pictures and animations and all that. I said that the title was a working title, Bibliophile. It is. I've set up a poll which should be active now on Twitter with a couple other possibilities for names. Go follow me on Twitter and vote on which one of those names you like best, and then I guess a couple of us, me and my friends, or the patrons in the chat group, we're going to decide between those two names. So the first book we're going to be looking at on this inaugural episode of Bibliophile/insert series name here is George Orwell's Homage to Catalonia. It chronicles George Orwell's time in the Spanish Civil War from December 1936 until roughly July 1937. George Orwell traveled to Spain. He traveled to Barcelona specifically through France. He not only was there to write about the Spanish Civil War, but actually decided to fight in the Spanish Civil War on the side of the Republicans in an independent militia, and spent 115 days on the front lines in the Aragon province. This includes some fighting at Huesca and an actual injury that Orwell received fighting, so this is the real deal for him. And make no mistake about it, Orwell is not an impartial actor by any stretch of the imagination. He is there as a devout anti-fascist and leaves the Spanish Civil War, leaves Spain as a devout democratic socialist. But we're going to come back to that in just a second. By the way, this is a work of nonfiction. I'm not totally sure I made that clear. It chronicles his time fighting in the Spanish Civil War up until the moment he leaves Spain. Before we can dive into the substance of Orwell's piece, we have to at least understand the context in which it is taking place. The Spanish Civil War is often called a staging ground for World War II, and we're going to see why that is. It took place between 1936 and 1939, and roughly speaking, one can describe it as a fight between those forces of the Republican government, that is the democratically elected government, and the forces of Francisco Franco, the nationalist that led a coup to overthrow that government. But to leave it there would be highly, highly insufficient. The reality is that both sides were not only an amalgamation of people within Spain and interests within Spain, but also international interests. On the Republican side, you have forces loyal to the government, sure, but those are far and few between. What you really have is a series of independent, left-wing militias. When Francisco Franco's right-wing forces began their coup against the government, against this democratically elected government in 1936, the Republican government really wasn't ready for it. They distributed arms, they held some cities, but in general, it was left-wing militias that rose up organically to fight this fascist menace that they saw coming from the South. The Republicans also had the benefit of international help, not from nation states necessarily, but from volunteers that came from all over the world to fight fascism. Orwell is one of them, a devout anti-fascist who came with the intent of what he called common decency to fight fascism, and that was what thousands and thousands of people did. You had thousands of volunteers from France, the UK, Italy, the USA, Canada, the list goes on and on. Political activists ready to actually lay their lives down to fight in what were called international brigades of the government. Now, when Orwell arrived in Spain, it was so early in the process that the government actually hadn't really formed its regiments yet, and so he was fighting in an independent militia called the POUM, P-O-U-M. So you have the Republican government, its consortium of independent militias, and then at a certain point, over the course of time, Stalin's Soviet Russia becomes more and more involved in supporting the Republican government in arms and pushing what we'll call anti-Trotskyism and pro-Stalinism throughout the ranks of the government regiments. And so over time, what you have in 1936 going into 1937 is a gradual transition from a bunch of hodgepodge militias into government regiments that were funded and equipped by the Soviet government. On the other side, we have the exact opposite. Not as many, but still some volunteers on behalf of Franco and his nationalist uprising. You also have international help from nation-states in the form of Germany and Italy, Hitler and Mussolini. Franco received lots and lots of physical help, soldiers, arms, and yes, even the Luftwaffe, Hitler's air force, participated in bombing Spanish cities during the war. So let's just reiterate this one more time. On one side, you have an amalgam of leftists supported by the Soviets. On the other side, you have an amalgam of nationalists supported by various fascist governments. This is why, to this day, the Spanish Civil War is considered a staging ground for World War II, and because of its unique place in time, just a couple years before Hitler's invasion of Poland, in fact, it ended around the time Hitler invaded Poland, it's often overlooked in the grand scheme of 20th century history. By the way, if you're interested in learning more about the Spanish Civil War as a historical event and not just one man's take on it, I can recommend to you Hugh Thomas's Spanish Civil War. It's a little old, but to this day is still considered the authoritative source on that event. Another book you might like is Antony Beevor's Spanish Civil War. Granted, it's more about military movements. That's the thing that he writes about. His most famous book, I think, is called Stalingrad. That's what he writes best. If that's your thing, definitely pick that book up. Let's talk a little bit about Orwell as a narrator, because I happen to think that Orwell is a very reliable narrator, despite his bias. Let's talk a little bit about that. There's no question at all that Orwell has a bias. He admits it himself. He says on page 140, there was the question of international prestige of fascism, which for over a year or two past had been haunting me like a nightmare. Since 1930, the fascists had won all the victories. It was time they got a beating. This was a time when fascism was on the rise. You had fascism in Italy that inspired fascism in Germany. You actually had rallies in New York City for an American Nazi party, and there was a legitimate feeling that maybe fascism was the way to go for the Americas. This was not an isolated ideology like we see it today, and it was on the rise, and Orwell knew it. He wrote, "When the fighting broke out on 18th July, 1936, it is probable that every anti-fascist in Europe felt a thrill of hope, for here, at least, or here at last, being Spain, apparently was democracy standing up to fascism." I butchered that quote a little bit, but the point being that Orwell came to Spain because he was inspired by the resistance to Franco, the resistance to fascism, or what historians today in Spain call nationalism. But, walks like a fascist, quacks like a fascist, probably is a fascist. However, I told you that I think Orwell is a very reliable narrator. Why? He admits very openly to his bias, he doesn't keep it a secret, and he says this, "In case I have not said this somewhere earlier in the book, I will say it now. Beware of my partisanship, my mistakes of fact, and the distortion inevitably caused by my having seen only one corner of events. And beware of exactly the same thing when you read any other book on this period of the Spanish Civil War." Orwell is telling us right from the get-go that he's trying to display the facts as he understands them, but we should take it with a grain of salt. And that, in my book, lets my guard down almost completely. You can also say that the account that Orwell gives in this book stands the test of time factually. There hasn't been a whole lot of dissection or disproving of the things that he's said. Additionally, I want to talk a little bit about Orwell's humility and the reason that his matter-of-fact and conversational way of writing lends even further to this image of him as a reliable narrator. Orwell has an aura of humility about them that makes the book much more endearing at the very least, but reliable on the other end, which is where I think the book lays. One is that he doesn't make himself out to be a hero at any point. He talks very openly about his fears. When describing his first instance of combat, he says, "Petty though it was, the whole experience was very interesting. It was the first time that I had been properly speaking under fire, and to my humiliation, I found that I was horribly frightened." So Orwell is, in his very first description of combat, is talking about how he's scared. He's not out to make himself sound like a badass. In another part of the book, Orwell's wife is being basically searched. Her whole room is being searched by the police in Barcelona. They're turning over tables, going through personal possessions, confiscating everything from personal possessions and leaving only like a passport and a checkbook. One of the things they get is a a stack of letters that Orwell has from his fans. And he writes, he interrupts chapter 11 to say, incidentally, they took away a number of letters I have received from readers. Some of them have not been answered, and of course, I have not the addresses. If anyone who wrote to me about my last book and who did not get an answer happens to read these lines, will he please accept this as an apology? You gotta be kidding me. What kind of author interrupts their own book to apologize to their fans? That's a level of humility you don't often find. Contrast that with another guy who was in Spain at the time, Ernest Hemingway, and his famous work of fiction, For Whom the Bell Tolls. Hemingway was also in Spain because he shared Republican sympathies. He also was relatively close to the front lines. He was in Madrid, just about 2 miles away, reporting on the movements of the Republican military operation. And rather than fighting, Hemingway was hanging out in a bar called Chicote on the Gran Via, drinking, merrymaking, smoking cigars, and writing a work of fiction that takes place in northwest Madrid in the Somosierra Mountains. Now, I asked in my poll on Twitter, at William C. Fox, Orwell, Hemingway. The answer is clearly Orwell. Everyone, that minority of you who voted Hemingway, you're dead wrong. Hemingway didn't fight. I'm not saying you have to fight a war to cover it bravely, but he wasn't even particularly good of a journalist, I've heard. He was always writing things like, oh, the Republic is just on the verge of winning, which, spoiler alert, Franco was the dictator of Spain until like the 70s, so they lost. And when he writes about the Spanish Civil War in For Whom the Bell Tolls, he like mistranslates Spanish intentionally, I guess, as a way of trying to immerse you in the foreignness of the country. He, instead of saying, I am 20 years old, a Spanish character in For Whom the Bell Tolls will say, I have 20 years old. Because that's like the Google Translate equivalent of I am 20 years old in Spanish. Or rather than saying it is cold, they'll say it makes cold, because hace frío in Spanish literally translates to it makes cold. What I'm trying to say is you have two guys in Spain at the same time. One of them writes a piece of nonfiction that's highly accurate and humble, and you have another guy who writes a pretentious work of fiction which is now much more famous than this piece of nonfiction. Guys, Orwell over Hemingway any day. The thing I like about Orwell's writing the most is the conversational nature of the writing. He doesn't have a lot of pop and circumstance in every sentence, as you find with many writers. I find myself guilty of this at certain times when I'm writing. He just speaks matter-of-factly as if he's talking to someone over a cup of tea. And that means that when he does occasionally use the floweriest of language, you know he's dead serious and he really wants to get a point across. In fact, at certain times in this book, you can see his emotions moving towards fancier and fancier writing, as if he started off his morning with a cup of coffee. He's just kind of writing down, well, first we did this, second we did this, third we did this. And then at some point in chapter 7, he's describing his time on the front lines, that 115 days he spent fighting, and he kind of just dips into poetry. And when he starts at chapter 8, he starts describing his journey, his leave back to Barcelona. And I want to read that passage to you because it's beautiful writing, and you just have to trust me on this. It sticks out because this beautiful writing, like, you don't find this all over the book. You find more matter-of-fact writing, which I think is equally valuable, but makes this portion even better. From Mandalay in Upper Burma, you can travel by train to Maimeo, the principal hill station of the province, on the edge of the Shan Plateau. It is a rather queer experience. You start off in the typical atmosphere of an eastern city. The scorching sunlight, the dusty palms, the smells of fish and spices and garlic, the squashy tropical fruits, the swarming dark-faced human beings. And because you are so used to it, you carry this atmosphere intact, so to speak, in your railway carriage. Mentally, you are still in Mandalay when the train stops at Maimeo, 4,000 feet above sea level. But in stepping out of the carriage, you step into a different hemisphere. Suddenly you are breathing cool, sweet air that might be that of England, and all around you are green grass, bracken fir trees, and hill women with pink cheeks selling baskets of strawberries. The other advantage of writing without a lot of flowery excess is that he can speak matter-of-factly about the miseries of war, the fear that he feels, and he writes particularly well about fear and futility. He writes about this battle that takes place at Huesca. Of course, these men who are under-equipped and ill-prepared for the battle are all itching for a battle, and eventually they're given the chance to participate in an offensive. And Orwell and his friends are behind enemy lines. I don't know if they're friends, but they're behind enemy lines with his fellow soldiers. They're piling up sandbags to try to protect themselves from a coming counteroffensive. And Orwell kind of turns to someone and just says, wow, this is bloody war, isn't it? And he says he remembers feeling a deep horror at everything. So he's not by writing so matter-of-factly, he gives us a more unfiltered lens into war and to the atrocities by just kind of describing them in the plainest way possible. And I like that. And this is my last point on the topic of his writing style, but I think it's the best example is when he's talking about his own imminent death. At a certain point in the piece, he is convinced he is going to die, and yet his tone of, oh, we're just having a cup of tea and I'm describing to you my experience in war as casually as possible, never stops. Just imagine yourself at a table with a cup of tea listening to George Orwell describe his imminent death. My first thought, conventionally enough, was for my wife. My second was a violent resentment at having to leave this world, which, when all is said and done, suits me so well. I had time to feel this very vividly. The stupid mischance infuriated me. The meaningless of it, to be bumped off, not even in battle, but in this stale corner of the trenches, thanks to a moment's carelessness. I think about those books that are written by people who have had near-death experiences, and they describe in the floweriest way possible how they were almost dead, or they were, the heart monitor had gone flat, and they were out of their own body, and their aura was going towards the light, and they saw grandma and their uncle and their dog from when they were 5 years old, little wag Timmy. What am I talking about? The point is that they use all this flowery language to describe things that probably never even happened, let's be real. But right here we have a guy who actually thinks he's going to die. We have evidence that he was wounded in the war, and yet he continues to be like, well, my first thought was this, my second thought was this. I quite like the world, I didn't want to leave. Just a quick aside, Orwell talks about his fears very well. He talks about rats and varmint and the sort of things that get in the wet, cold trenches during the time period in which he's waiting to take action. And a lot of people have theorized that this fear of rats translates into the character Winston Smith in 1984, who has a phobia of rats. And just to remind you, he says that, I'm about to die because of a moment's carelessness. And this drudges up the second theme, the second motif, which is futility. Homage to Catalonia is riddled with futility, partly because the Spanish Civil War, specifically the side of the Republicans, is riddled with futility. Training is superfluous, his comrades are bizarre, and his equipment is broken. His training in Barcelona lasted for like a week. It involved marching around the training guards with these like faux rifles, just practicing their marches, never actually even learning to shoot. He later learned that it was because they had no guns yet. They just hadn't received them, and much less any ammunition. And so when he's asking, hey, when are we gonna learn to use a machine gun? We're about to go to battle with this ragtag team of militiamen. And they're like, mañana, tomorrow. His comrades are also kind of worthless. He has untrained farmers, the proletariat, right, which is part of the reason he's drawn to this side of the battle. But nonetheless, you have people as young as 12, which are fighting, and he doesn't seem to encounter this as some sort of moral dilemma, like, oh my god, there are children on the battlefield. More of an annoyance, right? These kids are pulling out these flimsy grenades and throwing them just for fun. They're accidentally shooting people and laughing. They're juvenile. And he even talks about getting rifles. They get these crappy 40-year-old German rifles, he says, that God knows where they were procured from. And he says he looks down the barrel, he can see that this rusted piece of crap is not going to shoot anything, and yet this is the weapon he's been assigned. But, there's a hodgepodge of weapons that have been assigned to his little unit, and he says there was no effort made whatsoever to give the working weapons to the people who maybe knew how to shoot a gun. And instead were given, he said the best rifle in his group was given to some little 12-year-old that everyone called the maricon, which, not politically correct, basically they were calling him a faggot, right? But this useless child, who was just here you go, Nancy boy, I think is how Orwell described him. Here you go, have a gun. You don't know how to use it, but here you go. Very futile when you're considering that they went then to the front and were expected as these meat bags to hold the line against a very well-trained army of Africa of conscripts, colonial conscripts that were brought up with Franco to fight against the Republican government. And there's a shift here because Orwell believes in this moment, right? The fighting and maybe his training is useless, but at least the cause is just and they are respected as people fighting against the fascists. But this changes. When he goes back to Barcelona on leave, he noticed that there's an intense amount of infighting. As the government's trying to become more legitimate, trying to move their own regiments into the fight, they start to ban and in some cases persecute the militiamen who fought in these independent armies, these independent militias at the very beginning. The government's trying to move in and thereby push out the people that were holding the lines initially. And of course, the left being the left, they start fighting amongst themselves, right? So there's one anarchist group being like, well, you're not the real anarchist group. And then, oh, but there's the communist group, and oh, there's a Stalinist group, right? Here's a Trotskyist group, like all these independent organizations that are now bumping heads. And so Orwell then becomes disillusioned with the cause itself to a certain extent. He thinks, well, now the fighting is unjust, and now the side that I'm fighting on is now fighting itself. Why am I here? And yet Orwell is still interested in the classlessness of what he is experiencing before going back to Barcelona and seeing this infighting. He's talking about socialism. He's saying there's a sense in which it would be true to say that one was experiencing a foretaste of socialism, by which I mean that the prevailing mental atmosphere was that of socialism. Many of the normal motives of civilized life, snobbishness, money grubbing, fear of the boss, etc., had simply ceased to exist. When he first arrives in Barcelona, he's experiencing sort of this classless proto-anarchism in which revolutionary slogans are everywhere. You don't see any of the typical bourgeois elites roaming around. You see red flags. People are greeting each other with salud and not buenos dias because that's considered more bourgeois to do. Waiters aren't accepting tips because they're being, I guess, paid a living wage or something. And even in the military, the ranks are no longer as significant. If a commanding officer says, hey, you, do this, you could theoretically be like, why, right? And I think they even abolished titles. Everyone's wearing the same breeches. Everyone's wearing the same uniform or lack of uniform, right? Because they're just this hodgepodge of soldiers. And so Orwell is, at first in Barcelona, enchanted with what is going on. And in doing so, he becomes a more convinced socialist. But when he returns to Barcelona, he finds something has changed dramatically after 115 days on the front lines. He writes, everyone who has made 2 visits at interval of months to Barcelona during the war has remarked upon the extraordinary changes that took place in it. And curiously enough, whether they went there first in August and again in January, or like myself, December and again in April, the thing they said was always the same. The revolutionary atmosphere had vanished. He said bourgeois cars were back on the road. People were wearing smart summer suits. People like him who had joined independent militias were no longer getting respect. In fact, the government was shunning them. And in the cafes, the rich areas, the smart areas of town were populated with people eating well and drinking well, and again, shortages for the rest, for the proletariat, these people that Orwell had come to love so much. So when all Orwell arrives for a just cause and a just war, he quickly finds that the war might be just, but the fighting is futile. But nonetheless, the cause is not futile. He comes back to Barcelona and gradually becomes disenfranchised or disinterested in the conflict itself, gradually as infighting becomes more common. And eventually, spoiler alert, he leaves Spain. And the circumstances around his leaving is something that I think you should discover for yourself by reading the book. But nonetheless, Orwell leaves with having changed. And that's what I want to talk about next, how Orwell changed through Spain. I find myself wondering, why do I keep coming back to the Homage to Catalonia? Part of it's because it's a synthesizing of many interests in my life. I'm interested in the Spanish Civil War. You've seen that I made a video on it. I'm interested in Orwell. I like his other writings, Animal Farm, 1984, and a couple other books. I lived in Spain for a couple of years. I like this time of history. There's a lot of reasons, but more so than any of that, George Orwell does an amazing job of capturing a moment in time, of writing in a way that I find appealing, and of really capturing a people. He captures the Spanish well. He tends to poke fun at them, to talk about their disorganization and their lack of seriousness, and at the same time, talk about just how wonderful they are as a people. And despite all the bad things that happened to him, both at the hands of Spanish fascists and at the hands of his own comrades on the side of the Republic, he leaves Spain writing, curiously enough, the whole experience has left me with not less, but more belief in the decency of human beings. And he says, those first 3 or 4 months I spent in the line were less futile than I thought. They formed a kind of interregnum in my life, quite different from anything that had gone before, and perhaps from anything that is to come, and they taught me things that I could not have learned in any other way. Orwell is capturing sort of a paradox of learning, and also just the gradual way that people age. He came into the war as this idealistic person saying, I want to just go for common decency, I want to be anti-fascist, and he, over time, came to find that the things he believed needed to be challenged and needed to evolve. He didn't abandon his values when he left Spain and went back to England. Indeed, he became more ardent in his belief that democratic socialism was the way to go, and that the Western powers, the Western bourgeois democracies, needed to figure out that fascism was a real threat. He says, England might not wake up until the bombs are crashing over their heads. He's got this paradox of learning, right? The more you learn, the more you realize that you don't know. You know more about what you don't know, and thereby you know less. And that's kind of what's happening here, is that Orwell is jumping into the fray. He knows what he's against, fascism, but then realizes that things like Stalinism in the Soviet Union, and there's just other forces at work, and becomes, in a way, more mature in his political beliefs, and at the same time more confused. And he writes about how after he leaves Spain, he keeps thinking about Spain. On, I think it's page 161, he's describing how he just wants to get out of there. And when he first gets out, he's like stuffing his pockets full of cigars and food, because he's afraid that at any moment, the rations could come back, even though he's not in the country anymore. And I think he gives us this honest account of being torn, of worrying about his friends that are still back in Spain, of worrying about the fate of humankind. And towards the end of the book, he's forced to worry about himself. And he seems to kind of have taken up this phase of life. He's gone from writing to actually deciding it's time to take action and go to Spain and fight in the war. And when he leaves, he's back in a phase of writing. And it reminds me a little bit of Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, when at a certain point he writes to himself, this is a Roman emperor, "Put down your books." And I don't think anyone interprets that as him saying reading is bad. What Marcus Aurelius is writing is, there is a time to read and to study and to contemplate what one must do, and there is a time to take action. And I think a little bit about my own life, and I think I can draw a couple parallels with Orwell. Of course, I don't see myself as an actual fighter in a war. That's preposterous. But what I'm saying is that Orwell knew what he stood for, but wanted to learn more. At the same time, he wanted to take action. And that's what he did in Spain. He went, he took action, and he continued to learn. And in my own personal life, there have been multiple times where I felt like I need to experience something else. It's time for me to go out and to try something new, or to take on a cause. And coming and moving here to Washington, D.C., and ruining my background with a green screen rather than that beautiful blue wall that I had back in Germany, I came here for a reason. I wanted to take action. And part of taking action for me actually was to go back and do some studying so I could have a pretext to get to the place I wanted to be. But nonetheless, it's about not realizing that you can't know everything. At a certain point, you just have to jump in and experience life, because for all of us, the clock is ticking. How will you feel if you read Orwell's Homage to Catalonia? You will feel helpless at times. You will laugh often, especially if you've ever been to Spain and had experiences with Spaniards. You will learn about the context, the political context of World War II, and you will find descriptions of light and darkness, fear and futility, and you'll leave with just a slight bit of optimism about humankind. And that is Orwell's style. That's why I like him, and that's why I will continue to read him. And I highly recommend that you pick up this book wherever you can, preferably at your local bookstore, and give it a read. That is the first episode of Bibliophile/insert name here. Go to my Twitter, William C. Fox, vote on the name that you would like to run up against Bibliophile, and then me and some of the patron community, we're gonna make a final decision on that. If you like this, please leave a comment below, give me some feedback. If you want to support the channel, go sign up for Patreon. I hope to be back month after month, inspiring you to read more. I hope this has inspired you to read. And I just want to say once again, thank you for being my YouTube community. Thank you for inspiring me to be better and to read. And so my message that I'll leave you with is go out there, read, and be a better version of yourself. You won't regret it if you take some time out of your day to read a little nonfiction. And why not Orwell's Homage to Catalonia to start? Later, guys.